Well, good afternoon. Actually, good evening now. As it is 6 o'clock, we'll go ahead and get started for this evening's program. And thank you for joining us here at the Pikes Peak Library District, as we are joined by author Tom Young, who will be telling us about his newest book, Red Burning Sky, the history behind the book and the book too. It has garnered much praise since its release. Booklist and Publishers Weekly both provided it with starred reviews, and authors Vince Flynn, W.E.B. Griffin, and Jack Higgins have both had very complimentary things to say about authors Tom Young's books. The book Red Burning Sky is a historical spy thriller based on the real-life story of Operation Halyard, the largest rescue operation of American airmen in history. Known primarily to students of World War II, this daring plan to evacuate hundreds of airmen stranded behind enemy lines in Yugoslavia while simultaneously avoiding detection by the Germans. Facing overwhelming odds, it's considering and has been considered the greatest rescue operation of the Second World War. The author, Tom Young, served in Afghanistan and Iraq with the Air National Guard. He has also flown combat missions to Bosnia and Kosovo and additional missions to Latin America, the Horn of Africa, and the Far East. In all, he has logged nearly 5,000 hours as a flight engineer on the C-5 Galaxy and the C-130 Hercules, by flying to almost 40 countries. He has numerous military honors. He retired from the Air Guard in 2013 after more than 20 years of service. And in civilian life, he spent time as a writer and editor with the broadcast division of the Associated Press and works as a pilot based at Reagan National Airport during Washington, D.C. If during this presentation you have any questions, please put them in the chat box. The chat box is located the bottom of your screen where it says chat. Just click on it and ask your question. Today's presentation will be about 25 to 30 minutes. So we are pleased and happy to welcome to the Pikes Peak Library District, Tom Young.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, Brian. It's an honor to get a chance to talk with you and the Pikes Peak Library District about my new novel, Red Burning Sky. I certainly appreciate this. As you mentioned, this novel is inspired by a real-life event from World War II. It was inspired by something called Operation Halyard, that's spelled H-A-L-Y-A-R-D, and that was the rescue of more than 500 downed Allied flyers, mainly American flyers, in Yugoslavia in 1944. And it's one of the lesser known corners of World War II history. I find that even a lot of World War II buffs have not heard of this mission. I often refer to it as the greatest military rescue you've never heard of. And if you haven't, don't feel bad. There are some reasons why this thing was kept under wraps even well after the war. And we'll get into those reasons in a little bit. But maybe the first question that might come to someone's mind when they hear about this is, wait a minute. What were 500 downed American flyers doing in Yugoslavia to begin with? Of all places, how did they get there? The answer to that has everything to do with the target they were trying to hit. These were mainly bomber crews. They were mainly crews of B-24 Liberators and B-17 Flying Fortresses. And they had been sent to hit the German-run oil refineries at Ploiești, Romania. World War II was the first truly mechanized war, and that's why the Allied command decided that one of the best ways to stop Hitler's mechanized army would be to starve it of fuel. So the refineries at Ploiești became a high priority target, and for obvious reasons, they became a heavily defended target. These refineries were defended ferociously by the Germans with anti-aircraft artillery and smoke screens over the target and fighter aircraft around the target. And over time, a lot of aircraft went down. In fact, now I'll try to share an image from you on my screen. This is going to be a painting that's on the homepage of the Halyard Mission Foundation. It's a foundation dedicated to memorializing this event, and I'll tell you more about that later. But right now, I'll just show you this this painting that depicts a B-24 in combat over the refineries at Ploesti. And as you can see, perhaps the violence of action of this mission. The painting depicts the flames and just the situation as it might have appeared over Ploesti during one of these bombing raids. And over time, as the aircraft, as the 50th Air Force and other elements of the Allied Air Forces carried out bombing raids on Ploesti, a lot of aircraft went down. And I do mean over time. This wasn't just one big raid. There was an initial large raid against Ploesti, but raids continued after that for months. What would happen is the aircraft would damage the refineries. The Germans would make repairs, put the refineries back online, and the aircraft would come back. And this cycle just kept repeating itself for months. And so a lot of aircraft got shot down. The bombers' ingress and egress routes to and from the target took them over Yugoslavia. To be more specific, the routes took them over a region of Serbia called Ravna Gora. And that's where a lot of airmen bailed out of their stricken aircraft. And when they did so, they found themselves parachuting into a very complicated situation on the ground. They were parachuting into a civil war in the middle of a world war. In Yugoslavia at that time, you had two main guerrilla factions. You had the non-communist royalist Chetniks, led by General Draza Mihailovic. And then you had the communist-leaning partisans, led by Josip Broz Tito and favored by the Soviet Union. And when these two groups were not fighting Germans, they were fighting each other. And of course, history tells us that eventually the partisan side won the civil war and Tito formed a communist government in Yugoslavia. But to get back to World War II, both of these sides sheltered downed Allied flyers, but it was mainly the Chetnik side that was most instrumental in making Operation Halyard a success. And these guerrillas and the villagers who supported them were very brave and very generous in their efforts to support our downed airmen. As far as their courage is concerned, you can easily imagine what might have happened if the SS or the Gestapo had caught a farm family harboring downed Allied flyers in their barn, but they did that anyway. And also, it's important to remember that these folks were poor to begin with, and now they have all these extra mouths to feed, literally dropping from the sky. And still, they did everything they could think of to help these downed airmen. They hid them in barns and haylofts and cellars and stables. But over time, as the numbers of downed flyers grew into the hundreds, the situation just became unsustainable. They had to have been running out of places to put these guys. And you can certainly imagine if the Germans had swept through that area, probing every haystack with bayonets, the flyers would have become POWs at best, and the people who helped them would have become dead. So something had to change. That's why the forerunner of the CIA, the U.S. Office of Strategic Services, the OSS, parachuted agents into Ravna Gora to have the downed flyers and the villagers and the guerrillas build dirt airstrips by hand so that C-47s could come in and land and pick these guys up. The C-47 was the military version of the DC-3 aircraft. In those days, helicopters were in their infancy. They did exist, but they were very primitive. They had very light payloads. So, if you were going to do an operation like this today, you might use helicopters or vertical lift aircraft like the Osprey. That really wasn't an option back then. They had to do this with fixed wing aircraft. So they built dirt airstrips so that C-47s could land, pick these guys up, and shuttle them back to Italy. And they pulled it off. It was an astounding success. Over a period of months in 1944, going into early 45, They did a number of shuttle flights, picked these down flyers up right out from under the noses of the Germans in German occupied territory and got them out. And I'm an old airlifter myself. I was a C-130 flight engineer and also flew on C-5s. And I can tell you that what they pulled off back then with C-47s and World War II technology would be challenging even now with modern aircraft and night vision goggles. But they managed to do it because they didn't know they couldn't do it. They didn't get the memo that this was supposed to be impossible, so they went and did it. Just an astounding success. So you would think that with a military rescue so successful that this would have been publicized. You would think this would be splashed all over the cover of Life magazine. You'd think this would be all over the newsreels in the movie theaters, because it would have been a great morale boost for both folks back on the home front and for troops in the field. But that didn't happen. It was kept under wraps during and even well after the war for a lot of reasons. And like so many things that have to do with Yugoslavia, those reasons are complicated. Actually, the first reason isn't so complicated. It was just plain old operational security. They didn't know that they wouldn't have to keep going back and picking up more of these guys. And even after the rescue was complete, perhaps there was reluctance to do a victory dance about the rescue because you didn't want the Germans to take reprisals against the villagers who had helped out. But even after the war ended, it was still kept quiet for political and diplomatic sensitivities. Back then, the Soviets were our allies in helping defeat the Germans, and there was concern about ruffling feathers in Moscow. If we made a big deal about having worked so closely with the non-communist guerrillas who were fighting the communist guerrillas, so there was that. There was also concern about ruffling feathers in London. The British were and are our closest allies, but back then there were elements of the British government who favored working with the partisans, not because they had any sympathy with communists, but because they just felt the communist guerrillas were more effective in fighting the Nazis, and that was the top priority back then. Further complicating the situation was the fate of the Chetnik leader, General Draza Mihailovich. As we discussed a minute ago, his side lost the Yugoslav Civil War. And in 1946, Tito's government arrested General Mihailovich and put him on trial for high treason and war crimes. And in that same year, they executed him by firing squad. And I think it was seen as something of an embarrassment for the US that we couldn't do more to help prevent that we could not apply diplomatic pressure to try to save General Mikhailovich's life after he had done so much to help save our airmen. So that was a complicating factor. General Mihailovich's legacy is controversial, but after his execution, his reputation was rehabilitated to the point that the Truman administration posthumously awarded him the Legion of Merit Chief Commander for his role in Operation Halyard, for his role in helping save all these American airmen. Fortunately, although this was kept hushed up, it wasn't entirely lost to history. There has been at least one good nonfiction book written about Operation Halyard. It's called The Forgotten 500 by Gregory Freeman. Pardon me. Also, nowadays, there is a terrific historical foundation, the Halyard Mission Foundation that I referenced earlier. And I'll share a screen from them again. The Halyard Mission Foundation is a joint Serbian-American group, and it's dedicated to memorializing this event, to researching it. They are, for example, when they can find participants in Operation Halyard, they honor them with plaques and certificates, as you see in this image here that I'm sharing on my screen. Of course, by now, any participant in Operation Halyard would be quite old. So I think in a lot of situations, they're finding descendants and honoring them. They are also putting up historical markers in relevant locations in some of the villages that helped out. And they're even putting up memorials at some of the sites of the dirt airstrips that were built. And it's just a fantastic organization. Full disclosure, I am not a member of the Halyard Mission Foundation. I cannot speak for them. I'm just a fan of their work. But they're doing great work in researching this operation and keeping its memory alive. And I think for me, the big takeaway from the work that they're doing is that as they do more research, this thing just gets bigger. It's like peeling the layers of an onion. As you peel back more layers, you find out there's just more to learn. And they're learning that Operation Halyard was a bigger deal than historians realized, I think. Just to give you an example with my novel, in my novel, Red Burning Sky, I'll confess to having taken some historical liberties, mainly by compressing events. In Red Burning Sky, the action takes place in 6 or 8 weeks in the summer of 1944. But now we know that Operation Halyard went on from the summer of 44, at least until February of 1945. Also, in my novel, Red Burning Sky, I described the construction of a dirt airstrip. We now know there were at least 3. So the point is, if you read my novel, Red Burning Sky, and you think these events depicted are extraordinary, what happened in real life was even more extraordinary. This is just a heck of a rescue operation. So that's the historical background. Now what I'd like to do, if I may, is shift gears a little bit and tell you more about the novel itself. In Red Burning Sky, I tell the story of Operation Halyard through the eyes of 3 main fictional characters. One of the characters is a downed airman, a B-24 bombardier named Bill Bogdonavich. And Bogdonavich comes from a Serbian-American family. After World War I, his father immigrated to the United States. The younger Bogdonavich was born in the US. He's never been in Yugoslavia before, and he considers himself entirely an American and a man of the modern world. And the father's nostalgia for the old country and the son's disdain for the old ways have always been a source of friction between father and son. But now the younger Bogdonavich suddenly has a B-24 blown out from under him, and he finds himself dependent on people just like his father for his very survival. And over time, he learns to appreciate why they are the way they are and why they do things the way they do. So that's his character arc. Another of my main characters is one of the C-47 rescue pilots. And again, this is an entirely fictional character. He's not based on any real figure from Operation Halyard. His name is Drew Carlton. And Drew has a checkered past. He began his military career as a B-17 bomber pilot with the 8th Air Force. And when his unit deployed to England and began hitting targets in occupied Europe, on 3 occasions, Drew turned back and aborted his mission rather than dropping his bombs on the target. And in each case, he did so for mechanical reasons, but maybe sometimes it was a gray area about whether it was really necessary to abort the mission. And that earned him the reputation of a coward. However, he was a good pilot, so the powers that be, his bosses, decided he could best serve the war effort back home as an instructor. So he was sent back to the US. And he sees volunteering for this very dangerous Operation Halyard as a way to redeem himself, as a way to find his courage and get back into the fight. The third main character is a very young Serbian guerrilla, a guerrilla fighter named Vaza, and he's a teenager, a very young fighter. And believe it or not, that character is not based on, but inspired by someone I knew. But in the 1980s, when I was a student at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, I took a terrific course in Russian novels. And the professor was a gentleman named Dr. Vaza Mihalovich. And in his youth, in his teenage years, he had picked up a rifle and fought against Nazis and communists at the same time. His was just a classic American immigrant story. And he was a fascinating individual. He didn't talk to us a lot about his combat experiences. So the combat that you see my character Vaza experience is my imagining of what it might have been for someone like that in that time. Dr. Mihalovich, no relation to General Mihalovich, that's a common family name, but Dr. Mihalovich talked more about his experiences after the war. when his side lost the Yugoslav civil war to the communists, he found it prudent to leave Yugoslavia. He spent 5 years in refugee camps in Italy and in Germany. And finally, in 1951, he made his way to the US. And when he arrived in New York Harbor, they gave him an envelope with $50 and a bus ticket to Kansas City. He rides the bus to Kansas City, finds a job there that he's not real crazy about. So he moves to Detroit, takes a job on a Chrysler assembly line. And while working the assembly line, he paid his way through college. He got his undergraduate degree and his master's and his PhD. And he became a respected scholar of Russian and East European literature. And that's how he came to be my professor at UNC. Just quite a guy, quite a story. In his later years, he wrote poetry and short stories, and he did an English translation of an epic Serbian poem called The Mountain Wreath, which I refer to in the pages of Red Burning Sky. He marched for civil rights, and he became an avid fan of Tar Heel basketball. He was just quite a gentleman. There's a sad story about his brother, actually. His brother fought in another guerrilla unit and just disappeared. He went missing, and the family never found out what happened to him. And that just gives you an idea of the sacrifices that people in that part of the world made during World War II. So that's the background for Red Burning Sky. And thank you again for the opportunity to chat with you about that. And with that, I'll open it up for questions.
And if you have any questions, please deposit them into the chat box at the bottom of your Zoom screen. Red Burning Sky is author Tom Young's book. It was released on the 22nd of February by Kensington and is available in bookstores and public libraries everywhere. I know our library system has a couple of copies of your book, so if our audience that are here would like to read your book through us, please reserve your copy, or as I said, it's available at booksellers everywhere. So tell us a little bit about, let's see, World War II, such a big, momentous event in world history, and so many stories that many people know about, and probably many, many more that people don't know about. What led you to choose this as a subject for your book?
Well, I grew up listening to my grandfather's stories from World War II. He was a mechanic on B-17s with the legendary 8th Air Force. And that is what initially fired my interest in World War II. And his stories also helped fire my interest in aviation. It's what led me to join the military myself. And my first 6 novels were military-related novels set in present-day conflicts, set in Iraq and Afghanistan. But I'd always wanted to write a World War II story. And I guess what drew my attention to Operation Halyard was when I became interested in some of the special operations missions of World War II. I began to do a little bit of research into the operations by the OSS, and they really did some swashbuckling stuff. And not all of it was as successful as Operation Halyard. A lot of OSS officers lost their lives on very high-risk missions. And so in the process of researching OSS operations, that's when I came upon Operation Halyard. And that also interested me on a professional level as an old airlifter. You know, again, having been in C-130s and C-5s, airlift was my business. This was primarily an airlift operation. And it just struck me what they were able to pull off with what now we consider very primitive technology. And in some cases, these guys were landing on short dirt airstrips at night, and the fields were lit by nothing but burning hay bales. And I think of the challenge of doing that. And I think of, you know, some of the night landings we did on night vision goggles in Iraq and Afghanistan. And to think if I'd had to do that in a C-47 with no night vision, I mean, what these guys pulled off is just astounding.
Yeah, with only burning bales of hay to see how far you are off the ground.
Yeah.
Yeah. So in the process of writing your book and doing your research, did you actually meet any servicemen or native Serbians or anyone directly connected with this event?
Unfortunately, no. While I was researching this novel, I did not get a chance to visit Yugoslavia then and talk to any participants. But another thing that fired my interest in this mission and in this part of the world was when I was in Yugoslavia, in the former Yugoslavia, back in the 90s, when the conflicts were going on in Bosnia and Kosovo, and as what had been Yugoslavia was coming apart. My unit based itself at Ramstein Air Base in Germany, and we were flying in and out of places like Sarajevo and Tuzla. And I was struck by both the beauty of the terrain, the beauty of that area, and the tragedy of some of its history. It's just an endlessly fascinating place. And without realizing it, I guess that's when I started researching this novel, is just being in some of the same places where some of this stuff happened. It's beautiful terrain. Earlier, I mentioned the nonfiction book about Operation Halyard, The Forgotten 500. If you look at the photos that are in that book, it's clear that the central village where a lot of the coordination of this mission took place, a place called Pranjani, was a very rural place. Well, if you look at some of these villages on Google Earth now, which you can see, they're still very rural. They're still very remote. That's part of why the mission was successful. Is although the Germans occupied Yugoslavia, for obvious reasons, they had to concentrate their forces in the cities, and that created a bit more of a permissive environment in the rural areas. And that's part of why this mission was able to succeed. But again, it's a beautiful part of the world, and flying in and out of there really fired my interest.
In the back of your book, the last two sections, which are after you're finished reading the novel, definitely take those in here. You have one, historical notes, where for a couple of pages you talk about both real historical characters that were in your novel, plus historical characters you created, and the locations and the incidents and whatnot. How was writing for men that flew in World War II, writing for peasants in Serbia, writing dialogue for 80 years ago? What type of research did you do to accomplish that?
Oh, that's a good question. Writing from the flyer's point of view was relatively easy because although, of course, the technology is different from flying in my day, some things never change. You know, the emotions, the feelings when you're going into harm's way don't change. You know, when you see lights coming up at your airplane and you realize that's anti-aircraft fire, you know, that's something that I experienced and something that I could relate to. And as far as just making the technical references accurate, actually, that was the easy part because you can look at some wonderful training films that have been uploaded to YouTube, training films that go back to World War II, and you can learn a lot about how they operated aircraft in that day. So writing the technical stuff was fairly easy, and writing the emotional side of going into harm's way, you know, I had some reference points for that. What took the greatest leap of the imagination, I think, was writing the character Vaza, imagining what it would be like to be 17 or 18 years old, and you've decided to try to fight for your country, and it's a time when you're coming of age. That's what I guess I had to channel my 17-year-old self and imagine what it would have been like to deal with those kinds of issues at that age. But basically just imagine myself in that situation and, ask myself what I would have done in a given situation. But also another thing that I did to help write the Vaza character was I wanted to get familiar with the culture that Vaza would have grown up in. So, for example, I read a book on Serbian folklore, and this is a book that came out in 1910. This was a very old book. And that's when I learned about some of the mythology and folk tales of Serbia. And some of that I referenced from Vaza's point of view. And I just sort of did whatever I could to put myself in the mind of a 17 or 18-year-old Serbian guerrilla in 1944.
And you have written several other books. Your website is tomyoungbooks.com, and readers can learn more about your other novels there, correct?
That's true. My first 6 novels were set in present-day conflicts, set in Iraq and Afghanistan and the Horn of Africa and places like that. And they were more directly inspired by my own experience in the military. And then after my 6th novel, I made the jump to historical fiction and began writing books set in World War II.
And have you enjoyed that? Are there more on the horizon for you?
There are. I'm researching a couple of other ideas for possible World War II novels. It's an endlessly fascinating subject. In World War II, so much happened over such a wide part of the world in such a short time that we're still learning about it. I mean, you would think World War II has been done to death, but it really hasn't, because historians are still learning more about things that happened back then. Just to give you one example, I saw a fascinating documentary on PBS some time ago about a spelunker, a cave explorer, and he had always had an ambition to visit Ukraine and to visit some of the large, I think, limestone caves in Ukraine. It's what some of the largest caves of that type are in the world. And he saves his money and he goes to Ukraine. This is quite some years ago, before the current conflict there, and starts exploring these caves. And in the caves, he starts finding 20th century artifacts, shoes and cookware and combs and brushes. And he starts asking, why is this stuff in these caves? And then he came to find out that Jews who had been hiding from the Nazis and from other militias, from other pro-German militias, had hidden out in these caves during World War II. And that was something that somehow historians had missed. And this was a discovery made only within the past several years. So again, to make a long story short, we're still learning things about World War II.
One of our attendees is comments that he's excited to read this book. I have read the book. It is an excellent book. I know all of us will enjoy reading it. Another comment, question. One of the things that always interested me about writing is what gets left out. Were there any elements that you left out of the book that you might want to use in another novel?
Yes, and that's a great question. And it reminds me of a famous quote from Ernest Hemingway, who said, when you really know a subject, you know what to leave out. And, they say that the writer's best friend is his trash can. You write the first draft and then you start cutting things out that you don't need. One of the truisms of editing a novel is put every word on trial for its life. So there were things I cut out of the novel. But to the question about things that I left out that I might use in another novel, Operation Halyard involved flights from Italy to Yugoslavia to pick up these downed airmen and bring them back to Italy. So I had to do a certain amount of research about what was going on in Italy during that time. And in the summer of 44, the Allies had taken most of Italy. I think in June, they took Rome, if I'm not mistaken, but they had not yet taken all of Italy. So what was happening in Italy during that time was pretty fascinating. The Italians had not been particularly fond of the Nazis. Some of them had a hard time of it during Mussolini's reign, and so they were ambivalent in their loyalties, and the Italian people suffered in ways that are not necessarily widely known. And I think there's a novel in there somewhere just about what the Italians went through during that time as they transitioned from, a fascist government that was an ally of Hitler's government to coming around and essentially switching sides. So there's a lot of material to mine there.
And just of my own curiosity, who are some of your favorite writers of historical fiction and historical nonfiction?
Well, there's so many. The first writers I would mention, since we're talking about a World War II novel, would be some of the authors of the great World War II novels that came out in the mid to late 20th century. And those authors were veterans of the war themselves. And I'm thinking about people like James Jones, who wrote From Here to Eternity and The Thin Red Line, Norman Mailer, The Naked and the Dead, Herman Wouk with The Winds of War and War and Remembrance. I've read all of those, and they were quite an inspiration. Beyond that, pardon me, I had to cough there for a second. It's hard to say there. I'm also fascinated in the literature that came from World War I and from the Vietnam War. And from the Vietnam era, I've enjoyed reading writers such as Tim O'Brien, best known for The Things They Carried, Carl Morantes, his novel Matterhorn. It's also fascinating to get into some of the poetry written by the World War I authors, people such as Siegfried Sassoon, Wilfred Owen. There's a rich history of war literature there. And then, of course, I always enjoy reading nonfiction about World War II as well.
Great. Another comment that it seems like a fascinating and intriguing book. Thank you for being with us. And just as a reminder, the book is Red Burning Sky by Tom Young. And any final thoughts tonight? Any final thoughts from you, Tom, tonight?
Can't think of anything off the top of my head, but I certainly appreciate the opportunity to chat with you folks about this novel, Red Burning Sky. This has been quite an honor, and I certainly appreciate your interest in my novel.
Well, we thank you for being with us tonight and our attendees. As soon as this recording is available, we'll send out an email and post it on the Library District's account, along with a bibliography of Tom's books and some of the books he referenced, if you're interested in reading further about Red Burning Sky or Operation Halyard. And I'll close now by reading from the last sentence of your book, if I may.
Sure.
We always honor men and women from every generation and every battle that serve our country, but he writes to conclude the book, with World War II more than 3/4 of a century behind us, we have fewer and fewer members of the greatest generation left with us. We'll never repay the debt we owe them, but we can at least pass down their stories. And through your book and your story, you have accomplished just that. And we wish you great success with this book and with all of your future endeavors.
Well, thank you, Brian. That's very kind of you. I've certainly enjoyed chatting with you all tonight.
Thank you, Tom. Have a good night from Alexandria, Virginia. And thank you again for joining us this Thursday night here at the Pikes Peak Library District.
Thanks very much.
Thank you.